Good afternoon and welcome into the Takeup. Today we have episode 164, Transformative Software Tools, Operators, Automations, and Envelopes. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome into the Takeup on this wonderful Education Friday as we get to talk about some software tools, something I want to do for a little while. We talked about doing some more creative work. I know I went a little heady last time to talk about how we get into creativity. How do we get inspired? What do we do with the inspirations once we find them? And today I want to just talk a little bit about tools, especially in light of a recent article that I have coming out and some upcoming assets that you might play with down the road, stuff that you can't touch just yet, but that you might get later on from me and from folks in Brilliance, and some of the stuff we already have out there. So it's not just all in one software package. So that's the other thing I want to let you know is that this is every software package has certain tools that can allow you to do simple, easy transformations that we might not think about. But what I want you to think about in general, as we're talking about these tools, as we're talking about the way that we modify things that we have, is when we have tools in front of us, whatever they're intended to do, what do they actually do? There's one thing. So what does your tool actually do? So we're looking at what's happening on screen and we're saying, all right, what does this tool actually do? What does it provide us? What stitches are present once we're done? And what can I do with that tool, whether or not it has anything to do with the original intended use of the tool? So we've talked about this in other realms. I mean, if you go back and look at the piece I did for vintage looks and for rough distressed looks, where I used a quilt motif, a quilting stipple, in order to provide myself with a path that I could put a custom motif on, you already know what I'm talking about. Whatever tools we have in front of us, what they're actually doing in general is providing us with shapes upon which we can build and with which we can create new stitch blocks. So every tool we have, whether it's the stuff that I talked about and you'll see in the thumbnail, I said, all right, we want to talk about operators. So graphical operators, I'm going to discuss those really quickly and kind of talk about what those are for. And that's stuff that's like the Pathfinder in Illustrator, if you know it from vector software. Otherwise, embroidery software is not as universal in the terms, but we'll talk about those. Automations, just the different kinds of tools that we have that automate certain parts of what we do, you know, applique tools, automatic patch edging, as we have in Merrily if you're an Embrilliance person, or honestly, any of the other automations where we're talking about automatic borders, automatic, like I said, applique is a big one because it actually produces a certain set of files that we can then use, or a certain set of objects we can use. And then envelopes and text warping is another place that we can do some really interesting stuff. And that's the thing. There's different sorts of tools in each software package. So none of this is necessarily unique to a software package, though I'm going to talk about certain things that are specific to a particular package, and we'll discuss what that means. The real kind of nugget that I want you to come away with once we're done kind of discussing this stuff is that when we're talking about transforming the shapes in front of us, right? Any of the tools we use are operating on some sort of shape that we have in front of us, right? You can't take two shapes and subtract them if the shapes aren't there. But what we should look at is, are these tools usable in ways we might not expect? And can we chain them together? This is another thing I want to talk about, is what I call kind of a transformation chain. Thinking ahead into all the tools that we have at our disposal to say, all right, if I have a shape in front of me, but I want it to be something different, I want to change that shape. How can I change that shape, add to that shape to make something interesting for embroidery? How can I take this text, though I have a normal standard satin stitch font text, how can I warp it into a new shape? Then I want an outline from that piece. Then I want to put a secondary internal outline on it because I'm trying to make maybe a satin with a decorative edge. These are the kind of things I'm talking about. How can I make a shadowed version of text? How can I work with a piece and make it something else from the starting point where I'm at? And there are times where we're going to do that by just drawing shapes. We're just going to get in there and draw the shapes we need, especially if we already have the design portion in mind. The thing is, we have the opportunity through all these transformative tools, through the ability to add and subtract and composite and unify shapes, through the ability to expand and contract, to add contours, and through all of these other tools like envelopes and warping, to use these things in different, new, interesting ways. between us understanding how shapes are drawn, how vector works, because admittedly the embroidery world is very closely tied with vector, especially if you're in like in Stitch Artist, the tools are very similar between how a vector software would work and how other software, other software might not work quite the same in the embroidery world. We have a much more one-to-one way of using those modes of how how points work, how handles work, Bezier curves, splines, and the like. We have to understand that stuff. If we understand how those things work, how the different nodes work, and that should be something we learn from drawing and digitizing. And if we then go to that other stage and say, what are all of these tools, these automations that are changing those shapes, and what can we do with those shapes once we're done? We can start mixing that with all that inspiration I talked about last week. We're looking at pieces. We're looking at different kinds of embroidery as we take it in. I'm actually going to show an example of something that made me think about this. And it's from one of my retail research times where I was in an airport shop. I know you guys know I travel a bit. When I'm in the airports, I always look through all of what I consider resort wear, because that's what we used to call it when we made stuff that was location based. So one of the pieces I'm going to look at, it's from the airport. It's O'Hare in Chicago. So it's a Chicago piece. We had a nice sweatshirt. It has a really cool logo on it. It has a simple treatment that I thought, wow, this is something that anybody, even a non-digitizer with basic digitizing tools, could do with their existing fonts, with their existing text, with their existing shapes. So that's what I'm here to kind of talk about today, right? We're going to talk about how to use tools, transformative software tools, operators, automations, envelopes, warping, templating. That's another thing, is templates, which can be very useful for us for depending if we're doing like gift work or boutique work, or if we just for ourselves know that we're going to be using a template to make these shapes or warp lettering over and over and over again. We can use templates to do that. And then things that are in that kind of Pathfinder motif, the adding, subtracting, breaking shapes up, shape building, and the rest. So using shapes to build other shapes by adding them, subtracting them, and using other graphical operators. So yeah, a little technical, but trust me, we're going to do this in a fun way. This is not going to be a super heavy, super technical necessarily piece to go on. And I'm going to do some stuff in software and show you what I'm talking about, so you can see what I'm saying is kind of available to us. Just because we don't have exactly what we want in 2 clicks doesn't mean we don't have a transformation chain by which we can apply to a shape, apply to a letter, apply to a design, and create new looks, create textures, add decorative elements without necessarily just redrawing everything. So like I said, some fun, simple stuff that can allow you to do some new creative kind of treatments to pieces, add fun outlines, add texture, and also just help you to knock this kind of work out. And like I said, we're going to talk about how we can use our tools in ways that people might not expect, which is something that I hope you'll enjoy. I like to think of my tools not as what they are made to do necessarily, because sometimes people say, well, I've got a tool that is for applique. I'm like, well, the applique tool is a patch tool, because appliques and patches are very closely related. And conversely, they say, oh, the applique tool or the patch tool doesn't work the way I want it to. And I'm like, well, yeah, maybe we can't use one object and do all the different things to it all at the same time. But copying, pasting multiple objects, breaking those objects apart, and then altering them, it might get us closer to something we want in the final piece. We don't have to have one shape to one applique to one 3-step outline. We can break it apart and use that tool in multiple ways, or build our own pieces out of other tools. Use straight stitch, use zigzag stitches, use other stitch types, motif stitches, whatever it is, to build whatever we need. Both of these things should be in our heads. So what do tools do, really? How can we use them, whether or not it's for the intended use case? Because trust me, all of us are using tools that we could absolutely get more out of. And how can I set up a chain of transformations from my original thing that I have in front of me, the shape that I originally started with, into something that makes more sense for me, that is what I actually want? And so, like I said, we'll try not to get super technical. Some stuff I'm just going to show you some examples. Other stuff we're going to go to a nice article where I talked about some warping and envelopes in the recent Image magazine. And we'll just kind of go through some fun stuff today. So if you have questions, you have comments, you have stuff you want to discuss, by all means, jump in and derail the show, because it's supposed to be a fun time today. It's supposed to be something that's a little more creative, a little more direct, and let us play with stitches today, right? Because that's something I've heard is people are saying, well, how do I get time to play? I'm like, well, if you're listening to me, you probably have that time. I'm going to let you play a little bit through the concept of listening to this and maybe give you something that you want to go mess around with yourself. But first, if you're not on the replay squad, hey, if you're a replay squad, awesome. Comment anyway. You guys have been seeing that. If you're replay folks, I've been really trying to get out there and reply to the comments from the replay and like your comments, like your contributions, and let you know that we're hearing from you. So definitely hear from it. We do want to hear from you and want to get back to you. But I like to say hi to the people who are here and who are talking live. So if you're here live, by the way, this is the time to chime in if you want to hear me say something to you directly. Jorita is here from Austin, Texas, doing cool work, and she was talking about stuff one of my morning podcasts. She's doing some cool blending, so go for you, Jorita. Go do that. That's awesome. Love to see it. Daryl says, hey, hello from Monterey Bay. Nice to see you here. Daryl's awesome, out in California doing great work, always doing creative work too. And by the way, creative doesn't always mean adding a ton and adding more. Here's another thing I want to kind of hit on. So many people think that to do a nice, creative, interesting piece, they have to add a tremendous amount of stitching or add a tremendous amount of color or technique or more materials. Sometimes the creative work can be very subtle and be very on brand for the thing your customer wants. So realize you don't have to make masterpieces every time. Most of my work was commercial. It wasn't all massive masterpiece, hang it in a gallery work. And I'm happy to say that that's still good. You know, it's still worthwhile. So doing these little tweaks is still fun stuff to do. We should just know what we have in front of us. All right. Maureen saying, hey, from Southeast Pennsylvania. Hi, Maureen. Happy to have you in. Cindy's coming in from Texas. Nikki King. Happy to see you here. Helen's coming in from Baton Rouge. So happy to have you in, Helen. And we've got Barb coming from Minnesota. Everybody's talking to each other. Love it. Jeff is coming in too. Hey, Jeff. From the Embroidery Nerd. Go check out the Embroidery Nerd stuff too. We've got Frank coming in from the UK. Ramona's here. Say, got to be here for this one. Hey, you probably know all this stuff, Ramona. You're a digitizer. You know what's up. I'm just going to do some fun stuff today. Little stuff. But that's what I think we miss out sometimes. We think we have to do so much. Like I said, more labor, more stitches, more additions doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be that much better received. We don't always have to put more time, more money, more effort into something for it to be creative, interesting, and bring some people some joy. So just a good thing to think about that. And okay, Cindy's saying you're lost in the definition of tools. We'll get there. We'll get there, right? We're going to talk about these tools. So I know you're probably asking about like graphical operator, stuff like that. We're going to get there. I'm going to talk about them and we'll get further into it. But yeah, we'll talk about that. But like I said, there's a few different things we're going to refer to today. I always like to give you guys the links up ahead of time before we start in. So first thing I'm going to do is just let you know on the current article we've got out in Images Magazine right now. I'll throw that up on screen and I will copy that for all of you guys out there to make sure you've got that if you want to read this later. This is a piece which they have happily named, I guess, Trippin' Out. That is not the name that I put on it. I talked about psychedelic text warping because it's something that's been in the media and in the common parlance lately, doing these psychedelic warps. And I wanted to kind of get a chance for everybody to take a look at that stuff. So if you check that out, I'll go ahead and bring this up on screen for us. This is funny enough, we're having issues with our sharing again. So I'll have to tell you guys, if this goes real badly, we'll have to see what I can share. I'll go ahead and try and bring that back in. We've had some issues with StreamYard today, but I'll go ahead and try and bring that back in for you guys. So let's grab that entire screen and try and bring it back in. Hopefully we can get it. No, still not in. All right, folks, let me see what else I can do for you. Sometimes this happens, right? Live. If you want to check it out there, though, we do actually have a cool article in Images Magazine where I talk about doing psychedelic text warping. This is where we have kind of the large waterfalls and rising and falling text. It's not the only way you can do it. I show you some different ways you can work on it. There are some different types of tools, and I may talk about those as well because this text warping is something people have been asking me about quite a lot lately. However, we might go into some other details, and we'll have to see what we can do with that, right? Hopefully we can get our share going, because otherwise we're going to have a pretty slow day if I can't show you tools and show you stuff. There we go. Okay, we got it to update. So, by the way, this is that first article. Trippin' easy. Like I said, they called it tripping out. That is not my term for it. But hey, psychedelia, what do you want? So this is over there at that bit.ly link. But what you're going to see is this is the particular article we're talking about. We'll show you this patch, some other stuff. It really is about achieving warped text. Because this is the big thing, these kind of larger layouts that have these multiple text warps going on, they can be kind of hard in some software. In others, they can be a little easier to do. And I'm going to talk about these different kinds of envelopes as well as part of this today, since this is a big thing that people discuss with me. Not the entire thing we're going to talk about. The other thing I am going to let you know about too, which I'll go ahead and throw out into the comments while I had you guys here, is that I was recently on a show with Marshall Atkinson. I'm copying it live so you can see what I'm doing here. But I was doing a podcast really recently with Marshall Atkinson where I talk about kind of my history in the business. If that's something you're interested in, you want to hear about what we got up to and including talking about technology, AI, and the way things are going these days. I was on that Success Stories. SNS Activewear puts this out with Marshall, and that just launched. So if you guys want to hear me, and you can throw me on your earphones, it's not so visual. It's just me getting interviewed, so it's not something you have to watch like you're going to have to watch today. Feel free to grab that. And also, like I said, this is the other one that I think is useful. This talks about different ways we can do shaped warps and why there is some difference with software tools, depending on if you're going to have rigid envelopes versus freeform envelopes. We're going to go there, right? Enveloping is just where we're using a shape to warp something, in this case, warping text. And that's something that in the vector world is much more understood. The word envelope may not be what we use for everything. Some software does, some software doesn't. And there's all kinds of other text warping that our tools can do. But we're going to talk about all that stuff today, right? So I understand we've got some different tools to discuss. Certainly not everything is going to be the same for everybody's tools, but I just want you to kind of get on this concept of warping things through a chain of different tool sets, through a chain of different options that will eventually kind of get you to this place where you can change those shapes up and you can have like something different than what you started with without necessarily having to do redrawing. And I think that's something that's worthwhile to kind of discuss anyway. So like I said, that warping is one sort of thing, but the thing is I really wanted to get to a little bit of discussion as far as like graphical operators, because I think it's something we have to at least define very quickly and kind of give you a concept of. So if we have an example for graphical operators, I'm going to go ahead and put this up on screen so you can see what I'm talking about. This is what I mean when I talk about graphical operators. This is where we take multiple shapes and we work on one shape with another. So I'll put this up on screen so you can see it, and I'll go ahead and get myself out of the way. This is an example of the kind of graphical operators we're talking about, right? If we have these two shapes that you're seeing on the left-hand side, these are these two circles. If we're working with graphical operators, it's like these path tools, and these are from Stitch Artist 3. That's where they come from, but these are in every vector software, almost all embroidery software, depending on the level of the software you have. You can work with one shape on another. And in this case, we've got these very simple kind of two circles that are overlapped. I made them in a light density fill just so you can see where that overlap is between the two shapes. And what we can see here that we've got a subtraction set up where the top shape is subtracted from the bottom shape. So what do we have left over? We've got this kind of moon shape that's left over. We are subtracting the top shape out of that bottom shape. Think of it as punching through, punching down. You select both of the shapes, hit that subtract button. That's what you get. The other operators we have a union here. This unions and provides the outside edge of the entire shapes that are together. So these two shapes together are unioned into one shape. So if we have these two circles, now we have this kind of goggly two-circle union shape, this blob that's up here. We can use a flatten style operator. The flatten operator is going to take the two shapes and knock out anything that's underneath the shape. So instead of just leaving us with the subtracted shape, it's very similar. It leaves us with the top and the bottom shapes, but it knocks out anything invisible and flattens it down to one layer. So nothing is now on top of each other. Everything is flat, and we only have the shapes that are left that are visible to us. So now we have this kind of lunette, this little crescent moon shape, and we have the circle together. Now I've separated them after the fact. They would be exactly touching if I had just hit the flatten key, but I wanted you to be able to see that. And then we have a key where we have an intersection, an intersect key. And that means that where these two cover, like a Venn diagram, where these two circles come together, if we click that intersect button, we end up with this shape right here in the middle, which is where the two overlap. So that's one thing to just kind of know. These things seem like maybe it wouldn't be all that useful to you, but trust me, especially like this union shape, subtraction, using break lines is another thing we'll talk about a little bit, but really this is where I like to go. I like to use subtraction quite a lot. I will copy and paste multiple copies of a shape so I can cut different pieces out of it and have different pieces available. And especially when we're talking about things like that psychedelic text warping, if you have true freeform envelopes, now not all software does, You may have to do this in your vector software first and then do all your warping of text and then come in and digitize that piece whole cloth if you want to use true envelopes, because not all embroidery software has true enveloping of text. It has warping, but the envelopes are rigid. You can't do very wacky kind of shapes like I'm going to show you later. With those, you might have to do that work ahead. Otherwise, you can create these kind of great nested kind of waterfall shapes like I talked about before. And I'll actually bring those up and discuss those again. So we're talking about the stuff that's actually in the article, but I'll bring these up on my own system so you can see some what I'm talking about. Shapes like these, and this is from something that you might see more of later, where we have these entire shapes that are meeting very directly, and we have like inside of a circular shape, we've got these different waves, but instead of having something where we've only got a couple of points of articulation where we can warp one side or another, I can warp in just about any shape, and including having these shapes that are just really not the standard kind of warps you would expect. This is what we get from true freeform envelopes. But as you can see, when I'm working with this, it's very simple to start from a complete shape and then cut out that section. And we have this matching curvature because we cut the section out and then separate the two pieces to get these kinds of really interesting matching curves. Now, you don't have to have them fully match. If we're looking over here at this piece, envelopes within it, you can first see if I click on that piece that there's the existing text. This is done with existing fonts. So this is an envelope, a freeform envelope. This piece absolutely has some really random looking shapes. They aren't very cleanly cut exactly, so you don't have to have exact cuts. But when we have something where we want a split like this, the great thing is we can have one shape to start from and then run a split or cut out these individual shapes from each other as we work. So we can actually use these cutting tools, the subtraction, the flattening to create something like this pretty simply out of an existing square. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Now, this is what I talk about, that chain of transformation, right? If I start from a square and then I add in some of these cut lines and then I subtract those out and I then take my centerpiece and subtract that out again, I eventually end up with all these shapes. Then I use my enveloping tools. And in this case, because we have true freeform envelopes in Brilliance and especially in Stitch Artist, I can actually just set up these envelope shapes, and each of these shapes then can just be assigned a set of text that can change live. So if I change this to Takeup right now, this is where I talk about templating. Well, then if I click off of it, Takeup is going to warp directly to that shape because this lettering object is assigned to that envelope. And that's why I talk about this chain of transformations. I start with a square, I start to draw other shapes, I snap those through, cut them out, and then I assign my text to that, and now I've got this new shape. And more than that, I can now use these shapes to go to some other process. So now that I have these shapes, if I've got Stitch Artist 3, it depends on your software and what it allows you to do with whatever level and shapes you have. In this case, if I have Stitch Artist 3, I can convert to objects. And when I convert these to objects, the great thing is it actually converts those objects to the warped version in the envelope, not the original version from the text. And that allows me to start doing other processes, to start adding other stitch types to work on this piece, to then, let's say I'll go ahead and do a union. We talked about the union. Well, if we do a logical union here, I now have a new shape that should show up in my setup here. And I'm zooming all around the place. But if I now have my new union shape here, if I grab that, now this one was missing, I didn't grab all my shapes. You can see I've started to create a new set of shapes from this piece. I'd have to watch my overlaps and make sure I get them all correctly. But you can start to make new shapes from the original stuff you worked on. And I think, like I said, we're going to get a little deeper into it. But I want you to think about this process of starting from one thing and moving to another. Now, the simple, easy version of this stuff, we have much less, invasive ways to work on this stuff than doing super text warps. We can just do things like make borders, make outlines, make these kind of islands. We can do outlines on text. We can change things. And like I said, templating and all that stuff is cool, but we can start from something very simple and get to different shapes from that original look. So what I want you to just think about is, what do I have in my hands? What does the tool give me and what can I do with it? So I know that's probably, I said a lot of words between here and there, and hopefully I've defined some of those tools better for you to start. But that's what I'm talking about. Transformative software tools are going to take the shape that's in front of us and let us make something else out of it. So like I said, multiple ways we can go about that. We're going to discuss multiple ways that are happening. But the first part of that, when I say operators or graphical operators, that is very much what in a vector software or an Illustrator would be called the Pathfinder. And that's the stuff I showed you just earlier where you saw the two circles together. That is shape building. So using shapes to make other shapes, you punch things out and add things together to make a new shape instead of drawing the outline of the thing yourself. That's where we use the adding, the subtracting, the union, the flattening. Those are the kind of tools that I'm talking about when I tell you about operators. And you say, all right, I don't know what I would use that for in a simple context. Well, I mean, one of the best, easiest contexts is to say, if you need a border or you need a fill around something, you have a logo that you need to then fill something behind or text you want to fill behind. Super easy to handle that. And honestly, lots of people who don't digitize do this every single day because they use a tool that's in Embroidery Enthusiast that's called the knockdown stitch. And the knockdown stitch allows you to very simply and very quickly create a contour. It's essentially an expansion. And I'll show this to you very quickly, right? So that's the thing. This is also a place where we have the expansion tool in Stitch Artist 3 that allows you to do anything at all you want. But if you have Stitch Artist 1 and Enthusiast, you can make a new shape and then use it that wouldn't have been there otherwise, because you can use your initial tool to make something new that might not have necessarily been intended. So like I said, we know what knockdown stitches are. It's when we have a super high pile fabric we're trying to stitch on, like a really fuzzy thing, then we might want to go ahead and use a knockdown stitch. The cool thing is, all right, I've got all these tools that I can use to say, I want it to be bidirectional. I want it to have this density. I want it to have this level of inflation. Remember those words? Well, okay, I've made my little inflated knockdown stitch, but here's the thing. That's super cool. But if I've got the digitizing tools as well, what is this? This is now a new shape. Well, what could that new shape be? That new shape can be anything we want it to be. I can also change, if I've got the digitizing part of the tool set instead of just the editing, I can go in here and start changing things like the kind of fills that we're using, and we can change the densities, and now I can actually use that to make a traditional fill. I can go ahead and go down to traditional fill densities, and now I've got that fill to work with. And if I'm in my digitizing side of this software, I can now go through and start making different things with that shape. Now I have a fill. Now I copy it, paste it again, and I've got, obviously, I can work on making a border. I just narrow that out to my lengths. I change the color because I can, jump that in, grab whatever color we want. In this case, I'll just throw, violet on there. It doesn't really matter. And now I have that initial shape. And that's something that we can do with a tool that wasn't necessarily intended to work that way. Well, the cool thing is we can do that in any context, and we can use these tools to build on each other. Because once we've done that, and we know we can do that, we can then alter this shape. We can use graphical operators. If we have them, we can do whatever we want with this shape as we're working. And sometimes these shapes can be quite useful in creating special effects or something that is a little bit more than just knocking a big, palette of fill behind something. And the cool thing is, if we do already have the higher version of the stuff, the other thing we can do is just go straight into our existing shapes and say, all right, I want to actually inflate these objects. What the same tools essentially have a very similar look to them, right? They're doing something very similar. We're inflating these shapes and making a shape out of it. And if we click remove holes, that removes all the holes out of that shape, and the eventual shape that we make is very similar. For some reason it's hanging up a little bit, but we make a shape that's very similar to doing like a knockdown. And like I said, the other thing is, if we have the ability in our software to convert to objects, now the objects that are in our particular lettering are there open to us so that we can change them, alter them, and we can use them in these operators to make something new. If I grab my two pieces of these letters right here, grab the U and the P, we select them both, and I go into, my union shapes. I'm going to go ahead and create a logical union. What's going to happen is I now have a union shape that's giving me something new to work from, that I can make something entirely other than what we originally started with. And it's about thinking about that chain of processes that I think is worthwhile to us, right? So, like I said, all I'm talking about is thinking about these tools and using them for something new, something interesting, and understanding that we have this chain of processes we can go through and make something new. In the case of doing something very simple that you saw that we just dropped like a patch background for that, one of the things I wanted to show you is actually this. I'm going to go ahead and pull back and show you an image of something I thought was really great and I thought was worthwhile. And this was a piece that I saw out in Chicago. And like I tell you guys, I always do retail research, which is me looking through different types of pieces and trying to figure out like what is it about this that I think is attractive. Because when we're talking about resort wear, the stuff that is in a gift shop that happens to have, it's got a name of a city, it's got a name of a place, and some attached imagery. A lot of these are fairly plain. And so in order to make them stand out, because we don't have anything but most of the time the name of the place, we have to do all these processes to make them interesting. The funny thing is I saw a lot of these processes and realized most of them are done with simple transformations on basic fonts, basic shapes that are easy for us to get and work with, right? So let's go ahead and bring some of that stuff up and talk about it. So this is some raw photographs just of my last couple trips to Chicago, right? And I took pictures of some of the pieces they had, and some of them year to year are similar or the same. And so I'll just kind of go through some of these pictures and talk about it, right? So of course we have the classics. We've got a 3D foam baseball type setup. We can see that we could use expansion on our text to get our borders on this. In this case, it's probably best drawn individually because, satin stitches, we have to actually parse these together out of multiple pieces. So I'm like, all right, that might not be transformation simply. But then I saw a piece like this, and I'm like, man, this is so perfect. All we've done to make this so much more interesting than its original kind of satin stitch option is to create an inner, either a back stitch or a bean stitch inside of a satin stitch text. And look at how much texture we're getting out of this very small change to our art, right? This is something that's a very small change to our art, and it's something that we could achieve ourselves with the shapes we have in our standard fonts if we went through the operator process. I'm going to look at some others as well, but we're going to come back to this piece because I really was fairly taken by that. Because as much as some people don't like that stitchy look, this is embroidery. What are we trying to do here? We want to use embroidery to its best end. And in my mind, that includes using thread and making something look like stitches in a way that is artistic. In this case, we've got some spun poly thread. We have some, it's not very much thicker than a normal thread. It's more fuzzy than thick. But we do have these multi-pass stitches. So we're using standard threads, but in each one of these bean stitches is probably 3 to 5 passes. So look for a bean stitch, a multi-pass stitch. I think a back stitch would look great here, but it's just a little internal line on a satin stitch column. And it's really simple stuff, right? If we look through this piece, by the way, forgive yourself for errors, because look at this piece. We've got some gaps. We've got some stuff that's not exactly lining up. But if we look at this as an overall piece that's, in the stores, I think that was tremendously effective as a look. And let's look at some of the other stuff people had. People were buying these around me as I was checking them out. What do we have here? Rough cut applique. This has a very simple satin stitch text. What have they done to make it interesting for an applique? We have a very small expansion shape around the entire piece, very much like what I just showed you, done in straight stitch. And that's it. Aside from some post washing to this piece, that's all they've done. So really the entire thing is built out of expansions. If we look at some of the other pieces, certainly, okay, these are just some standard rough cut applique 3D foam. That's not exactly something we need to process. But then we look at something like this, and yeah, you can draw this yourself, but you could also do this text setup and then use expansion like I showed you to make this outside shield shape. There was so much of this stuff that I looked at that I was just shocked how much of it really relied on this process of just expanding out. And even if we look at this rough cut applique here, the shape that's on the outside of this entire applique baseball tail style text, and by the way, once again, forgive yourself some variation, folks. Look at how much variation we've got on this rough applique. You couldn't do this on perfect edge applique, but on rough applique, you absolutely can. All of this is predicated on using an expansion off of an existing layout of text. So super simple stuff that we can actually achieve with basic tools. So yeah, we had some interesting stuff there. And like I said, I'm always looking at all these different places. So you'll find like art museum stuff and everything else there. But a lot of just real simple treatments. Here's some cool multimedia, just something to look at. So a nice shape. This is a great thing. You could template, by the way. If every single piece had a different print of a skyline in it, you could make a template in your software that allowed you to have these text warps in place and just replace each city as you go and make multiple city pieces. So like I said, there's some cool stuff we can do with templating and warping and shaping. And this is one I want to kind of return to. I think this is pretty interesting, and it's a simple kind of process we can go through a chain of tools to achieve. So like I said, kind of simple stuff. Interesting to look at, but it's stuff where we really aren't doing crazy extra work, and you don't even really have to draw. Can you draw shapes to make this happen? Absolutely. If you want really tight, careful outlines on work, sometimes drawing is really the best thing you can do. If you don't have the tools that allow you to do all these transformations, you can absolutely do them by drawing it manually yourself. But if you have the tools available to you, why not? And that's the thing that I was showing on this other image we started here before. Now this, I'm doing one letter because we're not going to do something too crazy or too excessive while we're here. But this is a standard keyboard letter. This is coming straight out of Embroidery's font collections. And this particular one here is actually Circus. So if we go ahead and type this up, you can see this is Circus. This is what this comes from directly. So we've got an entire set of letters here that have that same kind of look. Now I'm using an outlined letter, but you could also use a solid letter and make an outline later. We can cover that in a second if you'd like to. But I went, like I always do, I use an E so that I'm wrecking my name, not yours. So this is a standard keyboard letter, right? So what do I do with this standard keyboard letter? Because I have Stitch Artist 3, I have a tool that allows me to, and some other software, basic digitizing may also allow you to edit things as shapes. It depends on what the software decides to put in what feature format. In this case, I'm going to right click on this piece and I can say convert to objects. Once I do, I'm going to get this, right? So what do I have now? I have the original digitizing objects that were used to create the piece. In our case, we also have a baseline and we can take that out, but we've got the original digitizing objects. So I already have something I can work with, right? I can play with this piece. If I want to do it kind of the hard way, first thing I'm going to tell you to do, you copy your original shape, paste it right on top. And if I've got these two shapes together, well, I want to hide the original one so I can't see it for a second. We'll bring that back in a moment. One of the things we can do is just go straight away and say, all right, I want outlines. And this is what often people do and they get very flustered. Why? Because the original outlines are also going to have the split in the shape that's made to make this outlined piece work. And we'll go ahead and set this to another color just so you can see it. We'll throw it on this orchid. It doesn't really matter, just so we have this piece we can look at. But like I said, what you're going to see now is that we've got this shape here, and that particular shape does actually show the connecting line that's here. So that might be something that you're not real fond of, right? We've got this original. We'll hide that original piece here. We'll try and hide some of these other pieces so we can look at it. But what we do have is the connector between the two sides. So you see that right here? I'm actually going to go ahead and drag this out of the way so you can see it. That connector kind of makes this piece look a little rough because now we've got this connector going between them. If we just want the inside, what a lot of people will do immediately is they'll start to go into editing, and you can just go into editing and delete the outside line. People think, oh, you can't do that because it's going to cause some issues. If you are a patient person with the lasso, you can absolutely do what I'm doing here. And here's hoping I actually get it all in one shot while I'm seeing the delay from StreamYard wrecking my actual ability to trace in live time. You'll see, right, I'm kind of juking around here, getting the outside selected only, right? You can see me selecting all the outside points, and we'll see how close I got. So this is pretty tough, right? I'm selecting all these outside points. Then I'm going to go around and say, all right, did I get just the outside points? It looks like I did. Oh, I missed one. So we'll go ahead and delete that. And now I do have just the inside outline, right? That's already not that hard. And if we have that piece together with one of the other originals, it would allow us to see that piece, in one chunk together. So if we have that piece, we can go ahead and throw that together. And now we've got that little outline that's going to run right on the inside edge. Totally fine way to do it. Not a problem, but there's other ways we can take that same thing and make it work. So we can see I've got that same thing over here, very similar. Well, what can we do? Start with that original shape again, right? We've got our shape here where it does have that cut still in it. So it might not be what everybody loves, but we go ahead and convert that to objects. Here's our shape. If we go ahead and drop in those run stitches, you can see we've got that connector again, right? Well, you know what the other thing we could do? We can use our tools. We know that we can slam two shapes together and we'll get a unified shape out of that. Go here. We're going to break across. Why are we breaking that across? Now I have two shapes that I can fuse together. I grab those two shapes that we just made, and then I can either try and overlap a little bit. In this case, I think they're closely overlapped enough that if I go over here and I union those two shapes, now you can see I've got a logical union. All right, so there's my union shape. What did that do for me? I now have a shape with no lines in it because I slammed those two shapes together. What are the two shapes? If I actually filled them with stitches, you can see one of them is this top half and the other is the bottom half. We think of those as entire shapes now. They're like a flood-filled shape. And you see that if you smash those two together flat, well, I'm going to get this. I'm going to get this entire unified shape, right? So once I've got the entire unified shape, I can separate the whole. And now it turns out I've got the inner and the outer outline separately. And that's how I created this piece. So now I've got that. I can do that too. That gives me another chance at, creating something out of that shape. And if I really wanted to, I could jump over here and align these. Now I would have just left the original copy in place if I was doing this myself without trying to show you guys on top of that. I would have thrown my outline on here. I'd have changed the color and I would have had, another type of outline that looked a little bit more clean to check it out. It would have been better placed, but I could have an outer outline and an inner outline. And then if I'm looking at those and I'm a little concerned about like they're lining up just exactly on the edges, well, the other thing I can do here, if I want to make sure that I'm going to have a nice spacing around it, and I'll go and delete that one that I dropped in all crazy. But if we have that inner outline, we want to make sure that it's going to cover. What I've already done here to this piece is I went ahead and increased my pull compensation. If we had no comp on it originally, I increased my pull compensation a little bit. Maybe we go like 3 points of pull comp, and we can see that now I have this riding on top of the inner edge of that satin stitch, and it's much more likely to run on top of that edge and stay put together. But that's from my original shape, right? That's all I've done. I've used the shape that was there. I altered the shape to get what I want out of it, and then I create something new based on that shape. And the great thing is this also goes for any other kind of work we want to do. Lots of people are trying to do like a central line of decorative elements right inside of this piece. Great thing is we can now transform again. Now I've got that inner line. Let's say that I want something right in the middle of this line. If I measure that length here, I've got about 6 millimeters. I got a really big wide satin that I'm showing you, but say I've got 6 millimeters, 6.4. Well, that means about halfway is 3.2 millimeters. Well, what can I do? I grab that line that we already started to work with. I go over into my graphical operators and I go to expand and contract, right? Inflate. So we call ours inflate. Some people call it expansion or contraction. We go ahead and give that 3 millimeters, right? We said 3.2 might be about halfway there. And we can already see that's true. Right there, I've got softened corners. I don't think I like that. Let's take the softened corners out. That might not work so great here, so I might have to edit. Let's try it with the softened corners, see what it looks like. Go ahead and say, all right, okay. And now I've got a central line that's running right down the middle of my satin stitches. So when I zoom back out, I now have this decorative line in the satin stitches. Plus, we're chaining that all together, right? Remember how I talked about chaining stuff together? Well, now that I've got that chain together, I can also go back to those original tools. Yeah, I didn't have to draw to get there, but if I really want to start working on things, I can go ahead, start to work on them, and make my manual changes, but I didn't have to draw the entire piece. You know what I'm saying? I can start to sharpen up some points. I can change the way that lines up. And frankly, I can also change exactly how far along I want that to go. Plus, what you may find, depending on the shape that you're working on, sometimes echoing from the outside edge is going to make a nicer line than the inside edge. So you might also, if you produced your inside and outside edge like this, you can go ahead and grab that outside edge and see if you get a better look. So instead of inflating it, we can actually do a negative inflate. So deflate, we deflate that piece by that same 3.1 millimeters or so. And actually, when I'm looking at that negative one, and I take out the softened corners, looks like I get better corners, right? So it looks like I'm getting a little bit better tracking to those corners from the outside edge and the inside edge, and I often find that's the case. Then we can use that one. And if I drag that over, now I should have put that in a better place so we could have actually seen that without me like aligning it incorrectly. But if I take this piece over here and I just tap it into place on top of the original, and I'll zoom back in so we can kind of see it, we can see that that's giving us a better tracking to the original piece, right? I'm a little off of my alignment, but if we take that off and I'll remove this other piece for us to take a look at it, I can put a nice big stitch right in the middle. I can align it and I'm getting corners that look a little bit more like where they should be placed where they are. And if nothing else, it does give me a starting point. It might not be perfect, but I can now play with it. I now have a shape that allows me to do some work and to play with the piece. And I can do interesting work with that shape after the fact. I can now do other processes once I get there. And if I've got this shape, that means I can use different stitch types, obviously. Or one of the other great things to do with a central line like this, change the order of that central line, put it way in the back, and now we can use this to create a filled shape out of an existing outlined letter that we had in our software. So it might not have been originally intended to be a fill. Or if we go and actually do an outer edge, I'm not going to go through the whole process of it. We can also go to any manner of applique with a normal, we can do a straight stitch or a no cover top stitch on that because we already have our cover stitch. And then as we have an applique color involved, we can go ahead and show that as a simulated piece of fabric, but we can create an applique out of that existing letter that wasn't originally an applique letter. Now, I don't think any of this is mind-bendingly crazy. This isn't stuff we haven't thought about ourselves. I think the thing is, some of this stuff doesn't always dawn on us when we're just looking at our original fonts, when we're looking at a true type piece that we bring in, a piece of SVG, we might not be thinking about stamping all that stuff out. And that's something that I've done previously on other examples where I've shown, sometimes you can make some pretty intricate stuff, or at least pretty interesting looks out of simple shapes and shape building. So like I said, it's not something that you're always going to be doing in the same way, but it is something to look at, is how can we use those shapes to create something interesting? And I think that's something that's worthwhile to look at. And strangely enough, I did something very similar, and I showed it earlier, to create a shadowed text element. And in this case, this is one that you guys may have seen before. It's from a font called Railroad, and I did it similarly to an earlier design and style that I worked on. But this is a shape that we can start from the shape of this outer letter E and create all of these pieces without redrawing anything. And that's another time where it really is about just thinking about our internal process that we have going on, right? So this really is not that difficult to make out of an existing shape in TrueType, and we can knock that together pretty simply. So I'll show you that really quickly, and then we'll get into some warping and talking about that text warp stuff that was in the article. But it's something that I thought was worthwhile just to kind of let you see. This is the shape that we end up with, right? But this is all coming out of this original outline. So if I take this original shape here, that's in front of us, I'll go ahead and take this other shape out of it because we don't need to see two of them. Go ahead and grab this. We're going to have to make multiple copies of it, but let's just say that I do want a shadowed letter. Sounds great. I'm going to go ahead and break that down, make my shadow right here. Looks like a good place for it. Let's see what we did on the other one. Yeah, something like that. So we'll go ahead and bring that out so we've got kind of an interesting shadow. So our secondary object is here. Well, let's go ahead and invert those. So this guy's in the background, the other one's on the top. So a guy who's going to be a shadow is in the back. This is in the front. We're going to go ahead and grab these. I'm going to go ahead and get our guy who's in the front, who's our main shape. I'm going to copy that so I have it for later. Grab these two guys, and we're going to go ahead, get into our graphical operators here. And I'm going to go ahead and subtract, right? So what do I have left? I've got these shapes. Are they perfect? No, I'm going to have to work on these shapes. But we now have shadow, and here's our original piece, right? So I've got a couple things I need to work on, but they're not too bad. I've got all my shadow bits here. If I wanted to, I can go ahead and give these guys already some kind of fill. We'll go ahead and drop these in. We're going to go on a super low density fill. We're going to grab a fairly low density background here. We're going to take these out. I'm going to go ahead and travel these edge so I can get some good travels on these guys. We'll go back into the original piece, travel edge, and we've already got this shadow. Now I can do some angle work with them later. No big deal. We can do that after the fact, right? So I've got these shapes all together. Not too bad. We're pretty happy with those. They look like shadows, and they're not underneath the rest of the text. I've got this piece right here that can be my fill piece. So if we actually use this to create our fill, in this case, I'm going to go ahead and make something that's got kind of a double squared look to it. So once again, high densities, we'll go with maybe go with that 15 point. That's fine. Actually, let's go higher than that. Let's go 30. Go 30 on that. We're going to change our initial angle here. We're going to travel edge on this piece. We're going to go into our underlay on this piece as well. I'm going to get that out to 30. So we got nice squares. We got a diamond on this piece. We're not going to throw contour on it. So there's our nice little hash marks. We can go ahead and make that a different color. Let's get something else besides that other color. So we can go ahead and have a darker color, lighter color. We can go to our palettes for that. So you know what I'm saying? Like we have that. We're going to look at our thread palette and say, all right, I want the slightly lighter color in here. We're going to go with this antique bronze. Well, maybe do redwood. It might be a darker color. Why not? We've got a couple different colors in here. Then we're going to take that same shape, copy, paste it, and throw down our border line. Now we got our border on this piece, and if we take that border, change that out to something brighter, we got our burnished gold, and then we can play with the thickness of that satin border and get it up to something a little higher, right? So we got a 3mm border, and we've got what can be a fairly complicated looking piece. Do I still need to sequence it and add my travels in and stuff? Absolutely. But I now have essentially this same shadowed letter can be created very, very quickly without a lot of work from the original piece. Is this something you can do all the time? No. But could you make something interesting if you had somebody came in and all they have for the concept of their art is Chicago, Illinois? All they have is a one monogram. All they have is a simple shape. This stuff can absolutely get you there. So like I said, this is just something to think about. We have this process of operators, automations, and we can use these operators, we can use these automations, we can use shape building, and we can use like I said, that transformation chain to get from one place to the next and create interesting looks out of existing pieces. And that's the thing. The same object can be used over and over in different ways, and we can create new outlines, new borders out of the pieces we have. And especially because we can do things like tracing, like outlining again, like unioning existing shapes to get the different parts and pieces that we need. So we got to think about that transformation change. And the way I think about that too is to say it's processing. There is a process that we go through from start to finish that gets us to that final look. And though every set of tools is going to be different, especially depending on your software, you might have different tools available to you depending on what you're trying to get done. You can still use that chain of different modifications to get somewhere without necessarily having to digitize yourself every little piece of what's going on there. So that's the very simple version of it, right? And I think sometimes it can get more complicated. It can be harder to control the more complicated that we get sometimes. But there's a wealth of really interesting techniques and textures, like I said, borders and outlines and shadows, and also very functional stuff like replacing fills, like adding appliques into bordered elements. And honestly, we can also use those same processes to take something that is not originally intended to be a bordered object and make it into one. I mean, that's the great thing is, like I showed you earlier, if you can convert your text into objects. Let's say we have our original text and we've already converted it into objects, but I need to make it so huge that I want to do a bordered fill out of it. Well, it's the same process that we use for something that is pretty pedestrian, right? Something that might happen to you any given day. You have to take a name, and suddenly we've got that name on the back of a big letter jacket, and we've got massive letters that aren't going to work in satin stitches anymore. And once we have that set up, we might think, all right, what do I got to do to get to that? As long as we don't have a tremendous amount of compensation in the original letters, if the shapes are pretty great, even if we don't have our original true type vector, we can go in and say, all right, I'm going to take this piece, I'm going to union this piece, and because everything is overlapped nicely, I get this new union, and maybe the union has some problems. I might have to work out the different problems in the union shape, but I might get a new border out of that union shape. Or depending on what you're working on in this case, you might get that new outline. And once you've got that new outline, you can work from that union, from that outline. Now, sometimes you're going to put that union together and go, okay, something's not good here. Something's not right. I've still got issues. In this case, I think I know exactly what happened. I had an existing outline in the stack. So let me take the outlines out of the stack. So this is now just, we see our columns here. We'll take out that union. All we have are these three columns. These are actually grouped together. So I'll unbranch those. We can see these are the three columns that make up that shape. We grab these three columns. If we look at them as a shape, we've got these three overlap shapes. Grab those, we grab our union tool, put them together. What do I now have? I've got an existing union that describes that same shape. We might have some effects that go on that we don't like. We've got a snag here we might have to take out. No big deal. Click that out, snag is out, and now that same shape is available to us to create a standard fill stitch style. In this case, I've still got my style from that hollow piece that I did earlier. Throw on a border. We can also expand and contract that border, and now we've got a nice filled letter out of an existing multi-piece satin letter. And from there, we can go on to making other kinds of cool effects by copying, pasting this shape, doing a deflate, like I said earlier. Let's take our corners out of it. We're going to go ahead and bring it in quite a lot. Let's go in toward the middle here and then do something interesting and decorative with it. And we can throw another decorative line. We can throw a back stitch. We can throw a chain stitch. We can throw in motif runs. And all of this stuff is available to us as we're doing this chain of processes, right? So it's one of those things where I just want to think about the different opportunities that are there for us, right? We have all these different opportunities to allow us to work on that shape and to use that shape for different stuff. So like I said, I don't think it's mind-blowing. It's more that it's something that if we're just doing standard work, we can get ourselves stuck in this place where we're kind of thinking about all of these different ways we might handle this that aren't necessarily they're just not letting us get as free as we could get with our process. I could very easily go through here and make some interesting stuff happen that you might not expect if I just think about what's there in front of me and what's possible. And if we get it repeatable, we can do it over and over and over again and get some interesting looks out of it. So like I said, it really depends on what you're looking for. You can make interesting, weird stuff. I don't think this is a look that I'm necessarily thinking is great. That K looks a little rough. I'm probably going to have to do some work on that to make it look nice. But, you know, if I worked on it a bit, instead of having to draw all that stuff, I could make something kind of interesting that would be worthwhile to me in the long term. And now I've got a cool kind of texture, a different look, a new bordered fill letter that I might not have thought about doing. And with that same look, we can do, like I said, remember that when you have the same shape, you can layer it out. If I then stuck that same decorative look on top of that existing piece we had, grab that other color. We can also use this to do things like those textured satin stitches people are fond of doing. Often it really is just a row of some sort of stitching down the center of a satin. In this case, we can use a motif to make anything we want happen on top of that satin. You can absolutely run that without that being problematic density-wise. Now, certainly I've got a lot of extra underlay in here that I didn't set up for this particular size, but, you know, I jump in here, pull some of that underlay out, make sure I've got a nice inset, and we're back to something that's a little more reasonable with our outline on top of it. The thing is, there's just a set of processes that are available to us that we can do with all these different tools, and it's worthwhile to think about it. Now I'd like to talk a little bit about the stuff that's in that article as well. So let's talk a little bit about text warping and envelopes. I'm going to keep it a little brief. I'd like to do a further episode on this full process exactly down the road. So it's just something I'd like to take a look at and just say, hey, people are talking about it, so I'm going to give you a couple definitions. I'd love for you to take out that article and check that as well if you have a chance. But it's something just to think about, how we do warps and how we have to do different styles. The thing I'm going to tell you is there really is one big difference in softwares that I want to tell you about envelopes, just to make this really super clear how kind of envelopes can work differently. And that is what I call a rigid envelope system versus a system that has a true or free-form envelope. A rigid envelope may not have as many control points on it. It doesn't mean that software using rigid envelopes doesn't have other enveloping methods. In fact, the first thing I'm going to tell you guys, if you're looking at Wilcom and want to do some of the stuff I've done in that article, I know that Vitor put out a video where he took a text box, made a text box into objects, then he made that text line into a motif, and then used that motif inside of a stretched motif column in order to do some of this work. That's another tool chain set. I like the ability to use freeform envelopes. It's a lot quicker for me, but you can totally do this in other softwares, or you can do this in the vector world and then bring it in. But there is kind of a difference between like a traditional envelope in that way and, like I said, the rigid envelopes, which I'm going to show you, and a freeform envelope. So I'm going to try and bring that up as well and do a little bit of that live. I think it's worthwhile to do that. So we'll do a little testing setup, and I'll try and set that up for you live so we can see a little bit of that. Nothing wrong with a traditional envelope, right? There's really nothing wrong with that at all. You often see them used as like a standard setup or lettering art. I'm going to show you some more about it. But let me just kind of show you what a traditional envelope looks like if I can grab something real quick. Like I said, StreamYard has been not my favorite thing today. StreamYard's been fighting with me. But on a traditional kind of solid envelope, or what I sometimes think of as a rigid envelope, there's some controls involved to try and help you not make something crazy in the warping. This is a traditional rigid envelope. In this case, you see that I've got the text that says testing. And in this text, we can kind of see down here that we've got these little nodules on the bottom and top. This one is done through this lettering art setup. And you see there's all these different forms of this lettering art setup. They give you an envelope that's already kind of fused in place. What this does allow you to do with these, you do have a couple of control points. What I'm going to let you see is that you see that control point's not moving off the vertical. I can't move it left or right. I can't change the curvature aside from dragging it up and down. So the arc is there. It is an envelope. It's a true envelope because I am seeing warping here. Also, if I grab the entire piece and stretch it, I can stretch the entire piece and it'll change it a little bit. And I can actually change the vertical kind of aspect of that envelope. But when I'm trying to like edit the envelope itself, it doesn't necessarily let me do more than that. Like it's going to have those two nodes on it. And depending on the type of envelope that you're working on, it may or may not allow you to do any more than that, right? In this case, rigid envelope here has the availability of these two nodes that you can move up and down, right? Nothing wrong with that. Works great. You can use them to make bridges. These things are all, but this is actually the same envelope done different ways. Now you might have a different envelope that has a sharp point, because in this case, we've got a couple of these that actually have a sharp point top and bottom. And we see that here in this diamond envelope. And in this case, it has straight lines. But if I try and like change that to a different line style, I'm not able to change that to a different line style. That is a more rigid style of envelope. Does this not work? No, it works. What I cannot do with this envelope, yes, I can do some warping like this. It's not going to let me add more points along that line, and it's not going to allow me to individually change the curvature of that line. Does this make this impossible to make something out of? Absolutely not. And in fact, one of the cool things we can do is, like I said, that chain of stuff. You want to get a pretty cool warp? Well, one of the things we can do with this to make a cool warp is we do our initial warp. So here's our arc right here. And then I go to this thing and I make this into, like, I create objects out of this piece, and then I can transform it again. You know what I mean? I can ungroup that, break it apart, and transform it again. And that's the thing. Once I break that apart, now I have the original shapes. If I group that up again, and I add another envelope to it. If I go to edit here, I add an envelope. I can go ahead and add a perspective envelope. And now, because I've already got one kind of warping going on, I can now warp again. And now I can get kind of this, baseball pennant kind of crazy envelope shape. But I did have to do two pieces, and it's a little destructive because it means I can't go back and change that arc again, right? So that's one kind of envelope. Works fine. Nothing wrong with it. But it isn't quite the same as, like I said, a free-form envelope. So I call those rigid envelopes just because they have rules in place to keep you from really kind of changing stuff too far, and to kind of keep you aligned, where your text stays vertical, stays pretty aligned. It's not going to go crazy, because when you have a free-form envelope, you can make stuff break. Eventually, you can make things that'll break if you're not careful with your shapes. You can make things that break the lettering, that make it not turn out as nice, right? Because we don't always... when we give ourselves freedom, we also end up with the freedom to make things not work so good. So I'm going to show you a freeform envelope. It's the stuff that I kind of showed you earlier. So this is in Stitch Artist, and Stitch Artist, by its nature, has a freeform envelope system. And in this case, I can show you in different envelopes. I'll show you one of these real quick. You can already see that I've got multiple points of articulation. And if I look at one of these shapes individually, I go to this envelope 2 here. We can see that I've got multiple curves I can use. In this case, I use the minimal number of points. But if we want more points, we can have them. We go over to some of these crazier envelopes, and we can see that some of them only have a couple points of articulation, but I can always add a point in. And if I add a point in and I start working on that point, I can then change the envelope, and I get an immediate reaction out of that envelope. In this case, I'll do it where you can see it a little bit better. And I can also change that point to an actual line point or a cusp point. And with that cusp point, allows me to then do sharp turns in the envelope. But as you can see, if I really mess around with this thing, I can absolutely make something that will start to, it can damage the font. It can make it look where it doesn't work correctly anymore because I've gone pretty extreme. But with that freedom means that I can do these kind of traditional warps. They're used for these like psychedelic text layouts, and I can really do a full warp that is much more like a vector warp. It's like what you would expect from CorelDRAW or Illustrator in the envelope method. Plus, we can do things like this where I can use the verticality of the sides of the envelope, and in the verticality of the sides of the envelope, we can see this, that we actually have the ability to change kind of the angular setup of those envelopes and of the text that's inside. And yeah, Joanne, you're absolutely right. This is 100% the pop culture letter from the 60s. It's really popular right now. People are using tons of it. And I've got some cool stuff you might see later on in this kind of world. So you're seeing some stuff early that you might see later, right? There might be some stuff coming around. Might be time, might be months, might be days. You don't know. But you might see this again. There's always projects in the offering. But the thing is, it's interesting. It's retro, but at the same time, yeah, it's though it is retro, though it is interesting, the psychedelia is where a lot of this comes from. It works best with some fonts and not others. And if you check out that article, pardon me, folks. If you check out that article, you'll see that I actually made the fonts that you're looking at here to specifically work very nicely with this style. Not all fonts are going to work the same way. And in fact, what I'm going to tell you is if you've got something that has big descenders like this, yes, will it warp inside that shape? Yeah, but when you have descenders, the very bottom line is going to be set by how far the descenders are, and then it won't fit nice and tight the way that these do that are kind of height limited. So like I said, not going to work with everything. But the great thing is these can go from being as crazy as this stuff. And like I said, we can change this stuff pretty easily. And the great thing about this is where we can use our kind of chopping stuff up, our multiple lines, our processes to make something cool. Because it's like, if I want to make something interesting here, I can just go ahead and draw my wacky shape. We know we want a couple of vertical sides on this, but let's say I just draw my wacky shape. We got a couple of vertical sides here. Want to work on this shape originally. We go ahead and close our shape up. That's already something that could be used as an envelope. But the other thing I could do then is copy one of these shapes. So I've got one of those originals again. I'm going to go ahead and draw a secondary curvature that goes through this piece. And I'm going a little too wacky with it, but all right. I'm not going to worry about it. This shape is not that important because this is just a shape I'm using to cut the other shape. So this is a closed shape. This is a closed shape. What can we do with two closed shapes? Well, two closed shapes are going to allow us to do a subtraction and punch that out. Now I've got the bottom shape. I return my original shape, and I'm going to go ahead and bring this up to the top again. I'm going to make a copy of that. Go ahead and select these two. I go ahead once again, go to my subtraction. I subtract that out, and then I end up with that shape on top. Then I'm going to go ahead and take all of this extra stuff that does not need to be here, paste back in the original bottom shape. Then I split these two shapes up a little bit. And all I have to do in order for these to work at least in our software setup, is I need to name these envelopes because I want these to be addressed as envelopes. Call these envelope 4. I name these so I can assign text to them later. Call this one envelope 5. Right? So there's my two wacky shapes. I now have them in an addressable format. We want to make sure that this top corner is the start and stop point for the shape. So I'm going to break it and make sure that's the start and stop point. Might have to do some corrections when this happens because I drew some pretty wacky shapes here that may or may not go nicely. That one looks like it's okay. Hopefully it holds up because I did draw some pretty wacky stuff that might not be the best. Sometimes you have to work on these things to make sure that they work nicely for the process. But now that I have envelope 4 and envelope 5, let me just grab letters 1 and 2 from this other setup here. We're going to copy those, paste those out, and those are over here now. And it really doesn't matter that they don't make sense now and they're not in the right place. Cool thing is, because we assign these to the numbers and they come after those pieces, as soon as I assign numbers to these letters objects, which are 4 and 5, immediately those are going to snap down. And once I get that renamed as letters 5, I'm going to go ahead and set that. Once I set it and get it into place, as long as my computer operates correctly and we don't get any more StreamYard problems, you already see letters 4 got where it was supposed to be. Oh, that's me. I accidentally added something in my name. See, it's got to be named envelope so it knows what to do. Now, letters 5 should pop right in as soon as I set it. There it goes. It pops into the place. When I let it go and I deselect everything, then letters 5 should go ahead and pop back in. So as we can see, we've already got the shape right here. Letters 5 should be popping in just a second. There we go. Let's go ahead and set that one more time, make sure it's working. And then letters 5 will pop in. There we go. So now there's my two sets of text, and it looks kind of like a weird little car. I didn't intend that, but that's what it looks like. And this makes it pretty easy to go ahead and have an interesting warped shape. And that's how I made some of these other shapes. Now, some of these I actually curated from different old school posters, Fillmore posters, stuff like that. This one was curated from an old book cover, and I kind of repurposed it and made some different work. But it's not just really weird and crazy shapes. This is also the same thing we can do with standard envelopes. You guys may have seen some of the envelope stuff I've done before, like these. And these are already set up as templates where we can do this same kind of work. And in this case, we actually have these as a library. It's a free library you can get for our software. So if you get any of the Embroidery software, you can use this free like envelope library. But we can see that we've got all these different envelopes. They don't have to be inside of a shape. As you saw from over here, the lines aren't going to show. We looked at those psychedelic envelopes. These lines don't stitch. So these little lines that you're seeing around those aren't stitch lines. They don't have stitches on them. They don't output in the final piece. So those are not part of the actual final piece. Those are just the envelope lines that we're using. Those are those same shapes. But if we go check out, like I said, these envelopes were made with these borders so you could use them as designs. And it's essentially the same in a bunch of the patches we have in Merrily. This is where templating can get interesting. If you make a nice template for something that you're going to use over and over again, it can be very useful. So if we check out Merrily, which is the patch software we have, I made a tremendous number of these shapes. The thing is, people kind of look at the shapes and go, okay, the shapes are pretty cool, but what is that for? What am I going to do with that? One of the cool things about the shapes is once you get these shapes in here, they're not just shapes. They also have additional templating involved in them. And they usually have envelopes and a baseline. So we have templating based in these. So we've got some cool rockers and stuff, some rockers that fit into our shields. So if we get shield 4, we pop shield 4 in here, and you can already see it's got some envelopes in it. If I grab another piece, and you can make these yourself if you have Stitch Artist, so you can publish these as well. So you can do this for your own software. And other softwares have templating. I mean, I know that there's sports lettering setups in Wilcom that are very similar. They're generally using lines that you're following and not envelopes, but some of them have the ability to do that. You can make templates by just saving a design and changing stuff as you go. But as we can see with this one, number one, I've got these patches that are made to fit together. If you make these, you can make a top tab that goes with your rocker. But the other cool thing is, as we can see, we've got some envelopes in here. And with those envelopes, we now have the ability to drop stuff right in. If you look at the notes on here, it tells you what the baselines and the envelopes are called, what you should name your lettering object to get a baseline or an envelope, and it tells you exactly how it works. So in this case, if I drop some new lettering on this thing, and once I've got these lettering, if I go ahead and say Albuquerque, which may be a little bit too much for you folks, might be a little too long, but if I change that and call it letters 5 in this case, I believe, you see it popped up there to that top tab. Well, now it's going to smash itself down to the tab. I might have to do some adjustments, but it works, right? Or if you had a police chapter or something else, or security, that's a good one. If you're making security patches for somebody, there's a lot of that going around. We can do that pretty easily. And then if we look at Shield 4, it also has those notes, and it actually has a envelope 4 here that'll go into that upper arc area. So let's go ahead and rename this into letters 4. And if we move it, you see how it pops over to the envelope. Now I've got that stretched in there. So you can make really useful templates. It's not just for making decorative stuff. This can be absolutely wonderful for making like team sports stuff or award stuff where you're going to change something every year. And depending on what you're using, this one also has baselines in it. We can check out the notes on that. We have the bottom left side, bottom right side. So if I call this thing letters 2, there's also baselines, and that's another tool that we've got. Not everybody has the same tool. We would have to change our scale on this. We change the scale of it, and it'll start from the top and go down. And if we grab these letters, we can also grab this bottom tracker, and we can track it up and down that line. And that's just extra little bits of automation that we can use to make stuff happen. Do we have to do work on it? Yeah, if we go around a sharp corner, that's not going to be the best. But we can use that as a starting point to help us get things aligned if we make these templates. So like I said, if we think about a combination of all this different stuff we can do, we can make some pretty interesting stuff. And sometimes it's for creative reasons. Also, it can be for things like templating. I mean, there's other fun stuff like I always love these pieces. We did a couple of these pieces where people used elements. We had a dinosaur where the back looked like bones, and you use these kind of jagged letters to make it. I made this for a Halloween and gave this one away where we can change the text, but it's in the shape of this kind of Cheshire cat smile. Well, if you want to have an Eric smile, I guess with a slash in it because I typed wrong, then you can go ahead and use something and have an Eric smile. Or if we want to have something for our wonderful Takeup viewers, we can do that same thing, right? Now we have our Takeup lettering, and that's something we can use inside of that smile. That's kind of the simple stuff. The cool thing is we can now take this, like I said before, if I liked how that turned out, I can convert that to objects. I now have those objects, and they're not going to pop back to those original letters. And once I've got those, I can do all that shadowing and outlining and stuff that I wanted to on these shapes. Once I ungroup these entirely, break these entirely up, it's like I can break all these up, fully ungroup them, and start working on them the same way that I did, because I now have all of my original columns. Now I've got my shapes that I can work from. And the other thing I want you guys to think about is this is great for when you're doing things like working on text. Let's say I've got this piece here, same kind of thing, right? I ungroup this entire piece. Maybe I'm missing a slash in my characters, but I do happen to have my eye. Use your warp, use your skewing, make your slash, use the existing shapes you have, and run processes on them. Like I said, now we've got this K that's got this little slight tilt to it. It's got that curvature to it. Let's say that's something we needed for another piece of work. We might use that envelope to get that curvature. But now I need a large K that has the same warp to it. All right, make it big. I need it in a fill instead. Grab this, go ahead and get that union going, right? So now I've got my union down here. So here's my new union shape. Union shape has the entire K in it. I can now go ahead and fill that K. I can use a standard fill stitch to do it. In this case, I've still got my goofy one I was using earlier, but we'll go ahead and just drop that density into some territory where it's a little higher. So now I've got a filled K. I can now copy paste that shape, throw a border on it if I want to. Certainly it'll have to be a lot smaller because I didn't make this very big, but we can now make a smaller bordered piece out of it. And if I grab the entire thing and scale it up again, I can work with that scaled up piece. We can go back to our border. We can make that smaller. And now I can take that warped piece and I've done all these different processes to it. And once I have that done, I can keep those processes up in the chain. In this case, I want a much smaller outline, so I go ahead and drop that outline size down. Now I've got a large filled version. Okay, am I still going to have to work with start points, stop points, doing all the technical labor that it takes to get this stuff right for kind of making sure we've got efficiencies? Absolutely. I'm still going to have to go ahead and work on my efficiency. Oh, of course, then I went and jacked something up. Yeah, but if I go ahead and work on my start and stop points on this piece, I can go ahead and do that. But yeah, it's like I can work on these pieces. I can do something different and create something out of it. And on top of that, like I said, think about all these different layers that we have and pieces we can work with. I can now take that filled object. We can copy it, paste it back in, throw it inside of that stack under that border. We can do a gradient style setup. We can do we can also do like a motif fill with it. And now if I go fill that with a motif, change my color, use lace work, use something else, I can then make these multi-layered stack designs. And it's just me going through the process, right? It's going through the process of step to step to step. How can I make something interesting out of it? And I think, like I said, lots of digitizers naturally get to this. I think the funny thing is this is kind of a thing that we can bridge that basic kind of setup between digitizers and embroiderers, where if we've got an embroiderer who wants to do some customization, they can do something really interesting with these pieces. But like I said, I'm going to go ahead and show you some other stuff. It's not like we can't do this with other tools. It's about just thinking ahead about that scale of, or not just the scale, about the chain of things we can do. We can use our graphical operators. We can add. That's the other thing I also say too. You want to make a patch out of something. Certainly you can have a patch tool. We have that as well. And I'm going to bring that up. Let's say now we like this design so much, we want to patch out of that design. Well, obviously I can grab what's selected here. I can select the entirety of this K design that is now here and make a giant patch out of it. If I choose to, just grab over here, grab my selector instead of my editing tools. And yes, I could use an automatic setup. We can go ahead and do an automatic page wrap edge on that piece. And I've got that patch now. I can make that patch and make that into an applique style piece. But that also is the beginning of any number of other treatments that allows us to make logos that have that background on them. If we think about that Chicago piece that I showed you earlier, that's that same kind of style and setup. We would just run through that piece and say, all right, I've got my initial text. What can I do to decorate it? I can blow it up. I can make a field behind it. I can make an applique out of it. I can make a rough cut applique. I can add borders. I can add treatments. We can inflate to make borders that are around entire areas or objects. We can deflate to make borders that run on top of existing objects. We can union to make outline versions of things that were originally filled. We can then use those outlines to make fill or applique versions that have borders on them. We just build on those shapes and go through the process. And honestly, that's kind of how I make most of the stuff that I'm doing in the patch kind of realm, where I do those custom contoured shapes. That same thing can be done with other basic tools. We could use graphical operators to do it, or we can use automation to do it. But either way is actually viable. And the great thing is this comes in play with all sorts of actual problems, right? That same sort of cutting things out, that same sort of using those pathfinders can really help us with stuff like applique. People often get really flummoxed by having two shapes and they want to applique both shapes, but the borders are on top of each other. And are you looking for some other automated way to handle it? I'm actually going to try and quickly, literally on the fly, show you one of these problems. Now, usually it's a letter with a shape behind it. It's a little more complicated, but we're going to go ahead and do the two circles thing that we've talked about before. And we're going to say, all right, I've got my two circles. We're going to get ourselves two different colors. And I'll go ahead and bring these back up so you can see what I'm working on. But let's say we've got our two circles, and these are eventually going to be two applique pieces, right? So I could even go ahead and make them applique style pieces. In this case, they've just got E-stitch borders on them. I made them huge because I'm working in a huge hoop, but let me go ahead and back those down. And the thing that people are going to get upset about is like, yes, one's on top, one's on the bottom, but see, there's stitching behind there that seems like it shouldn't be there. Well, the first thing is don't draw stuff you don't want. Break it apart. You can draw it and break it apart, but you can start it and make it very clean. Let's say I want this to be under this other piece. Grab these two shapes. I'm gonna grab those, right? We've got them both here. We've got our graphical operators up here, working Stitch Artist 3. We can flatten those objects, and now this object is no longer that entire shape, right? Yes, it still has the border on it, so we're not quite done, because if we drag this away, we still have this line, but now we've taken that line out. We've cut a nice clean spot in it. Once we get into this line, we can go right here, right click here. We can break that apart, open up that shape. Once we open up that shape, we can see which one's on top, which one's on the bottom. We grab the correct one. So I've got the one that's on the bottom. Take out that point, take out that point. I return to create my applique line, and you can see now what do I have? I've got one color applique here, one color applique here. As they run, I only run one border. There's a placement line. There's my applique tack. There's my placement line for the top one. There's my applique tack. I now no longer have the shapes underneath because I use the graphical operators to get me there. So that's the thing. Instead of just taking our two, whatever our vector files were, and slamming them together, we start and do a little bit of process on them to make sure that they actually have the areas missing that should be missing. And then we can do whatever we want after the fact. Now I don't have to have stitching that I'm hiding under stitching. And even if I don't cut that piece perfect edge like this, and honestly, I probably wouldn't, I'd probably allow for a little overlap on that actual cut. I can actually do that too. I can make my own cut line. Let's say I don't like the cut line that's being produced where it's a perfect little shape, right? I could go back from here and make my alterations myself. I could have it go under the other piece if I liked it. So I can make my own shape. I'm going to go ahead and put it back into just a standard outline and then close it again. And now I'll have a shape where in this closed shape, I can actually change this and let that be the cut line. Let's say I make that a line node. If I want to, that can be a cut line. Even though it's showing here as not part of the applique system, I don't care. If I export that out to my cutter that I'm going to use, that'll work, right? So let's go ahead and copy that since I accidentally took away my other piece. We'll go ahead and bring back that piece again. And now if I paste that back in, I would have my cut line, all right? So same thing, I can make cut lines that don't exist by changing the shapes. Or if I wanted to have two different colors of stitching that go on top of each other, but I want one big shape, I can take these two pieces, grab this, copy them, paste them both. I'm going to go ahead and make these shapes again so they're just outlines. Just have those outlines. Grab this guy. I'm going to close him back up so he's got a line in between them. So this is now a nicely closed shape. Then I'm going to go ahead and union those again. What do I have here now? Well, if I grab that shape, it actually got moved off to over here because I was selected incorrectly. If I union those shapes again, I can end up with, if I just grab the union shape, I actually have both of these pieces in one big cut line. So if that was two kinds of fabric or one big piece of fabric, but I wanted this line to be present, I don't have to just rely on the shapes that are there. I can slam those shapes together, make that simple shape, send that to my cutter, and then I can use that to create a line in my applique stitching that is not followed by my cut line. Just because this will produce a cut line for you, if we go into this color and we tell it, yep, I sure want a cut line for here, and I go into my applique settings and say, give me my cut line and save that out for me, yes, I can do that. I can save myself out a cut line for my cutter. I can save myself out an SVG, and it'll be this circle. But just because I can do that doesn't mean I can't make my own cut line out of those existing shapes if I want something that doesn't follow the exact method that is normal for the tool. I have the ability to make my own stuff out of what's there, no matter what the tool is originally intending to do for me, right? So that's just one of the things to think about. Like I said, in all of these examples, from lesser, easier things to do, from normal pieces, out to the psychedelic weird stuff that I did today, where I've got more of this stuff you'll be seeing from me soon, because I've gotten kind of into this retro type. So it's something you might be seeing shortly and might be able to get your hands on. To the stuff that I showed in the article, like the Karma patch, which, by the way, what did I do with this that's interesting? Instead of just using the standard fill, I went ahead and jumped out and checked out like another fill. So I dropped this little decorative fill on top of the patch. So I've got a standard applique patch, but I went ahead and threw in a decorative accordion so I could get some just kind of interesting shading and texture on it. How did I do that? I copied and pasted out that shape, and I expanded it a little bit so it would fit up under this piece and made that my shape. It's not exactly the same shape as I needed for the outer border, but that's fine. I can do what I need to do because I use those modifiers, because I can use operators, because I can use the inflation and deflation. It allows me to use the existing shapes and make what I need pretty readily. So like I said, do I think this is stuff that's going to blow your mind? If you're a digitizer out there making cool stuff, absolutely, it's not necessarily something that you're going to be freaked out by. You've done all this. You've already needed to make a patch or a border, and you decided, man, I'm done drawing this stuff and I'm going to use the existing shapes that are there. The thing is, if we combine the knowledge of what these tools do, what they literally do, not what we think they do, like I said, because you could use other tools to make these shapes, various ways work. If we know what they actually do and how they work, if we also know how our particular software handles shapes, handles points, handles curves, handles, he'd say handles, but that's what I'm talking about. Bezier's handles our splines. And if we mix that with our knowledge of the physicality of embroidery, how things are supposed to be layered, how we're supposed to handle compensation. So like I showed you earlier, I compensated that interior stroke on that satin stitch letter so that when we got back to the actual piece that had that little decorative stitch on it, that we ended up with it riding where we wanted it to ride in that final piece. That's all part of that kind of set of techniques, but it's all part of just understanding embroidery and understanding our tools. We have that ability then to use what's in front of us to make more. Like I said, we know what it does. We understand how the union works. So I know that if I'm not getting the kind of union I want, I might have to cut my shape into a couple different pieces to make sure that it actually overlaps the way I want it to. If I'm not getting a good seal, a good overlap where it's not trying to, put the two shapes together that I want to, I can go in here and say, well, if I tuck these in a little tighter so that I make sure they're overlapping entirely, now I know for sure this is going to union. If you understand how the cutting works, how the union works, how the inflation works, like I showed you earlier, that sometimes the outer edge gets you a nicer, cleaner piece toward the inside, a cleaner representation of the outer shapes than the inner edge might be inflated. Sometimes that's the case, but we understand our tools and work with the way that they work. We work with the way that they function. Then we combine that with our knowledge of what we need as far as insets, what we need as far as coverage on our applique to make sure it's got a nice grip on all the fibers that are around the edge, what we need for compensation to make sure we have that nice overlap like I showed earlier in this piece, so I can make sure when I do finally stitch this piece, it's not just riding on the edge, it's going to have a little bit of meat to dig into. And this one I must have dragged it a little out of alignment, but we can see that we've got a nice overlap. It probably needs a little more compensation even than that. We can make those adjustments with those tools that give us some automation, but we don't do it in a way where the automation is taking away from us. We do it in a way that just reduces the amount of time it takes for us to make these looks, to make these things work. And we remember that if we're transforming a shape, one of the other things to remember, not all software does it the same way. Some software, when you inflate or deflate a shape, will leave the original shape in place. Some won't. Always copy your shape first. Copy that shape and keep it there, or copy and paste and work on the new pasted copy so that you have your original in place. You can always take it out later if it's not supposed to be there, but you always want to make sure you retain that original so you don't end up having to work away from the original piece. Or if you're trying to do multiple processes, you might have to have that shape back again. But we can work from those original shapes. We can break them apart, make them into something new. And like I talked about last week, we can do creative recombination as well. But the thing is, it becomes that much more powerful when we mix that with an understanding of graphical operators, how shapes work, how tools work, and with that fundamental knowledge, the knowledge that we always talk about on this show. What happens when fabric, stabilizer, thread, needle, machine, and file meet? If we make those things intrinsic to our understanding and then work with those tools, with that knowledge in our heads, we can make great stuff, interesting textures, interesting treatments, without always having to draw. Am I going to always say that there's room for us to draw? Absolutely. Learn to draw. Learn to do that work. It's great to be able to do that manual work. Start, though. If you're just starting with customization, you can start by doing editing like this and then customizing. Once you do a little bit of this kind of work, right? Do a little graphical editing, do a little bit of compositing, then do some drawing on top of that, do some editing of those original shapes. And like I said, not all of it requires Stitch Artist 3 or the top end of Wilcom. Some of this stuff can be done with lower tools. I am going to say, though, that most of the automation, most of the shape drawing, most of that Pathfinder graphical operator stuff is going to be in the higher end tools. But you can also go into your vector software and do that too. And in fact, like I showed in this article, I'm actually going to bring up the files that I sent over for those folks. I originally kind of showed them how I think this article should go. What a lot of people are going to choose to do eventually is just do this in the art stage as well. And so one of those things to remember is you can also just do this in that art stage and do it in your vector software. So if you don't have the embroidery software that has all of this yet, one of the ways we can learn that stuff is to go for start out with doing this stuff in our actual graphical software, and they all have these envelopes. And that's something that I think it's worthwhile to kind of think about. We have this concept of working with graphical envelopes in any sort of vector software you might have. And it's super well worth it to kind of take a look at it. So like I said, I'm going to just bring this up really, really quickly before we shut down today and say, yes, we can do this stuff with our freeform envelopes. And that's what you're seeing in a lot of these. Those are the freeform envelopes that are in Stitch Artist. Also, people can make these envelopes for you and you can use them. Even if you're in Essentials, you can use that stuff if someone makes the envelopes for you. But the thing to remember is it's also entirely possible, and I'll show you guys, if you're in CorelDRAW, we have this same possibility here where I use those same shapes. In fact, I exported these out of my Embroidery software as SVGs. You can use your true type fonts, grab those, throw them into envelopes in like CorelDRAW or any of your Illustrator type vector softwares. And then you start from these and digitize on top of that, because you can then bring it in instead of using, and like I said, auto digitizing, probably not going to do it for you. I showed this too. Auto digitizing will often end up in some weird stuff happening, but we can still bring it in and draw on top of it the way we would digitize anything else. And at least we've got those original warps and cuts and things done previously to doing it. Now, like I said, you can also stack this stuff together if you don't have those true warps. It doesn't mean you're stuck with just the warps that are based in the tools. Yes, you can use those warps in the tools that are there. You can use the existing kind of word art style warps, and there's nothing wrong with those. But you aren't necessarily stuck with just that as far as warping. I tell you, the software is just flipping out. You can do the stuff I showed you earlier where we can start from one setup. We go ahead and do a perspective warp, and then we do an arch warp, and we can still get some interesting stuff happening. So remember, even if your tools don't have everything you think you need or want, like I said, if you're not rolling in Stitch Artist where we do have those envelopes that are true to kind of the vector style envelopes, you still have a chance to use the other tools and think about that transformation stack, right? So it doesn't mean you're out of it. The transformation chain, how do I go from A to B, doesn't have to be a straight line, doesn't require only one tool, and you can build what you want if you think about how the tools work. So, like I said, got a little long, wanted it to be fun. Hopefully it gave you some kind of cool ideas to work on, something that you might think is interesting to try. But what I really encourage you to do is go look in the software that you currently have. Even if you're just into your vector software, you're not into your stage of doing heavy digitizing yet, look at the tools that are available and think about how you could chain them together to make something new. So make something new, take time to play, let yourself do self-directed projects. Like that patch is something that I made for essentially for me as a way to think about this. And it led to a new project that might be something more than that. But it started from me just kind of having my own curiosity, letting myself play with something that wasn't customer focused, and allowing myself to expand from that non-customer focused place into something where I'm kind of the only audience, or I have an imagined audience. For me, it was the people who were doing all that cool psychedelic work. I thought about that audience and tried to serve them without it being something that I'm under a deadline, that somebody's waiting for, that there's an event happening, and it let me play. So take some time to play, try some stuff out, and hey, share it with me if you want to see it here, or even if you just want to share it with someone else who's going to geek out as much as you do about embroidery. All right, folks, with that, I can't wait to do it again next time. If you have stuff you want to say, jump into the comments and let me know. Even if you're in the replay squad, we love you guys. So show up, let us know what you want to see next time. And I can't wait to do this all again next week.